In the serpentine bends of the Mississippi Delta, where the cypress trees droop like mourners and the air hangs thick with secrets, there once stood a plantation that fed on more than cotton and cane. The Croft family of Redwater Reach maintained a taste that had nothing to do with fine wine or imported delicacies and everything to do with flesh that walked on two legs. For 21 years, a slave named Eli stood over their kitchen fires, preparing meals that would turn the stomach of any decent soul. Night after night, he carved and seasoned and served what his masters called their special meat, knowing that each dish carried with it the weight of unspeakable horror. But on one October evening in 1859, as the Croft family gathered for their annual Founders' Day feast, Eli served them something different, something final. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe so you don't miss the truths history tried to bury. The official records speak of a mysterious disappearance, a family that simply vanished into the Louisiana mists. But the ledger Eli left behind tells a different story, a story of systematic consumption that lasted 2 decades, of a man forced to butcher his own kind, and of a revenge so complete that it erased an entire bloodline from the earth. This was not just murder. This was an operation that fed on human lives for decades, until the cook finally decided to serve his masters their last supper. To understand how such horror could flourish for decades, you must first understand the place that sheltered it. Redwater Reach was not merely isolated, it was forgotten by the world, a serpentine bend in the Mississippi River where the water ran rust-colored from the iron-rich soil and the Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from ancient cypress trees. The only way to reach the Croft plantation was by ferry, a rickety wooden platform guided by a single weathered man who asked no questions and remembered no faces. The river curved around the property like a moat, creating a natural fortress where screams would echo only among the trees and secrets could rot undisturbed in the thick, humid air. At the heart of this isolation stood the Croft Manor, a white-columned monument to old money and older sins. But the real business of the plantation happened elsewhere, in a detached summer kitchen built of soot-stained brick positioned strategically downwind from the main house. Smoke rose from its chimney day and night, a gray finger pointing accusations at an indifferent sky. Behind the kitchen stood the smokehouse, its thick walls designed to contain more than just the curing of ordinary meat. The building had no windows, only a single heavy door secured with an iron lock that jangled like chains in the humid breeze. Nearby, the hog pens sprawled in the mud, filled with enormous, well-fed swine whose grunting provided a constant guttural soundtrack to the plantation's daily operations. What no one who visited ever truly grasped was the deliberate design of this arrangement. The kitchen positioned to hide its smoke, the smokehouse built like a tomb, the hogs fed on scraps that came from sources the guests never questioned. Every building, every path, every sightline had been carefully planned to conceal the true nature of what transpired in this forgotten corner of Mississippi. The bayou beyond pressed close against the property lines, a maze of black water and twisted roots that could swallow a man whole and never surrender his bones. It was into this labyrinth that people occasionally wandered and from which they never returned, dismissed by the outside world as unfortunate souls who had lost their way in the treacherous swampland. This was a world unto itself, ruled by one family whose tastes were as old and twisted as the riverbanks themselves. The Crofts were not monsters in appearance. They were pillars of Mississippi society, their names etched in marble at the Episcopal Church in Cypress Crossing, their charitable donations funding orphanages and widows' homes across 3 counties. To the outside world, they represented the finest traditions of Southern aristocracy, refined and reclusive in the way that only the truly wealthy could afford to be. Ambrose Croft. The family patriarch carried himself with the rigid bearing of a man who believed his bloodline made him superior to ordinary mortals. Tall and stern-faced, with iron gray hair swept back from a high forehead, he spoke often of purity, of maintaining standards that lesser families had allowed to degenerate. His obsession with genealogy bordered on the fanatical, as he traced his lineage back through generations of plantation owners who had carved their fortune from the rich Delta soil. What Ambrose never mentioned in polite company was how his ancestors had maintained their strength. How certain appetites had been passed down like heirloom silver from father to son, a family tradition more sacred than any recipe for mint juleps or cornbread. His wife Lavinia presented the perfect complement to his austere authority. Delicate as porcelain in appearance, with pale skin that never seemed to flush, even in the oppressive Mississippi heat, she moved through their social circles like a ghost in silk. But beneath her ethereal exterior lay a will of iron and tastes that would have shocked the ladies of her charitable organizations. She spoke in whispers that somehow carried more weight than shouted commands, and her pale blue eyes held secrets that could freeze a man's blood. The family's twin sons, Silas and Phineas, had inherited their father's arrogance and their mother's cruel intelligence. At 25 years of age, they strutted through Cypress Crossing like young lords, buying rounds of drinks at the tavern and courting the daughters of lesser families with lazy confidence. They were known for their appetites, their expensive tastes, their casual cruelty toward their father's slaves. What the townspeople didn't know was that the twins had been raised on stories of their family's true heritage, weaned on the understanding that they were apex predators in a world full of cattle. They had taken their first taste of the family's special meat at the age of 16, a coming-of-age ritual that bound them forever to the Croft legacy. To their neighbors in Cypress Crossing, the Crofts were simply old money at its finest, mysterious but admirable, the kind of family that lent prestige to the entire region. The annual donations to the church, the generous tips to servants, the polite inquiries about local families, all of it painted a picture of Southern nobility at its most refined. But those who knew them best understood that the Croft generosity came with a price. Servants who worked too closely with the family had a tendency to disappear. Business partners who asked too many questions about the plantation's operations found their contracts mysteriously terminated. And anyone who ventured too close to the truth about what happened in that smoke-stained kitchen learned that some secrets were guarded by more than mere social discretion. Behind the white columns and the charitable giving, the Croft family's true sustenance came from a building that reeked of smoke and secrets, where their meals were prepared by hands that trembled not from age, but from the weight of unspeakable knowledge. In the spring of 1838, a 12-year-old boy named Eli arrived at Redwater Reach in chains that seemed too heavy for his small frame. The ledger records his purchase price as $200 marked with the notation "for kitchen," a designation that should have raised questions but never did. He was quiet to the point of muteness, his dark eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes from witnessing things no child should ever see. Ambrose Croft had specifically requested a young cook, someone who could be molded to the family's particular needs, someone whose mind could be shaped before it hardened into moral resistance. What he found in Eli was a boy broken enough to be compliant, yet intelligent enough to learn the intricate skills that the Croft kitchen demanded. The boy was placed under the tutelage of Jeremiah, a man of 35 who had served as the family's cook for nearly a decade. Jeremiah was nervous around the new arrival, his hands shaking as he showed Eli the basics of fire management and knife work. He spoke in whispers when they were alone, his eyes constantly darting toward the main house as if the very walls had ears. What disturbed the other slaves was how Jeremiah tried to shield the boy from certain aspects of the kitchen work. He would send Eli on errands to the vegetable garden when certain deliveries arrived at the smokehouse. He would take over the preparation duties entirely when Ambrose Croft made his evening inspections, positioning himself between the patriarch and the child like a human barrier. The ledger shows that Jeremiah had been purchased in 1828, noted as experienced in butchery and preservation. For 10 years, he had performed his duties without incident, his skills praised by the family, his behavior described as reliable and discreet in the household records. But something about training a child in the family's methods seemed to break whatever psychological accommodation he had made with his circumstances. On a humid September night, just 4 months after Eli's arrival, Jeremiah made a decision that would seal both their fates. He approached the boy in the pre-dawn darkness, shaking him awake with urgent, trembling hands. According to what Eli would later remember, Jeremiah spoke of escape, of taking the boy north where they could find freedom from the horror that had consumed his life for a decade. But Jeremiah had underestimated how thoroughly the Croft family monitored their most valuable property. Before sunrise, both cook and apprentice were dragged before Ambrose Croft in the main house parlor. What happened in that room was never recorded in any ledger, but the screams that echoed from the house that morning sent the other slaves scurrying to the farthest corners of the plantation. By evening, Jeremiah had vanished. The official story, according to the ledger's terse notation, was that he had absconded in the night, a runaway slave who had abandoned his comfortable position for the uncertain dangers of life as a fugitive. A line was drawn through his name with thick black ink, as if to erase him not just from the records, but from memory itself. But Eli knew better. He had seen the fear in Jeremiah's eyes, had heard the desperate urgency in his whispered warnings. More disturbing still, he had noticed that the hogs seemed particularly well fed in the days following Jeremiah's disappearance, grunting and rooting with unusual satisfaction in their muddy pens. With Jeremiah gone, the full weight of the kitchen and its terrible duties fell onto the small, unprepared shoulders of a child who had already seen too much of the world's cruelty to believe in rescue. Once each year, the Croft family opened their doors to a carefully selected group of guests for their annual Founders' Day feast. The invitation was coveted by every family of standing within 50 miles of Redwater Reach, a mark of worthiness that acknowledged one's place in the social hierarchy of Cypress Crossing. Reverend Michael Albee was among the fortunate few invited to the 1858 celebration. His diary entry from that evening described crystal that caught candlelight like captured stars, silver gleaming with the patina of generations, and conversation flowing as smoothly as imported wine from the Croft cellars. But it was the food that truly set these occasions apart. The Reverend wrote of dishes that defied his understanding of Southern cuisine, preparations that blended European sophistication with something indefinably exotic. The centerpiece was always a stew of such rich, complex flavor that guests would fall silent upon their first taste, their faces reflecting pleasure and bewilderment. According to Albee's account, the meat possessed a texture unlike beef or pork, with a richness that coated the palate and lingered long after the meal ended. When he complimented Ambrose Croft on the dish, the patriarch merely smiled and spoke vaguely of old family recipes, techniques passed down through generations of cooks who understood the art of bringing out the finest qualities in their ingredients. What the Reverend could not have known was that the silent figure who served the meal had learned those techniques through methods that would have horrified any decent soul. Eli moved through the dining room like a ghost, refilling glasses and clearing plates with mechanical precision, his face a mask that revealed nothing of the knowledge burning behind his eyes. The guests never questioned the cook's haunted demeanor, dismissing his silence as natural deference. They complimented the family on their excellent staff, noting how the boy anticipated their needs, how he moved with the efficiency of someone who had learned that any mistake might carry consequences too terrible to contemplate. Year after year, the same ritual played out, the same expressions of wonder at the meal's extraordinary quality, the same polite inquiries about recipes deflected with practiced ease, the same satisfied murmurs from guests who believed they were experiencing the pinnacle of Southern hospitality. In his diary, Reverend Albee noted one disturbing detail he tried to dismiss. As the wine flowed, he found himself studying the young cook's face, searching for explanation for the profound sadness he glimpsed there. When their eyes met across the candlelit room, the Reverend felt a chill, a moment of recognition that something unspeakable lurked beneath this perfect gathering. They praised the chef, never knowing the recipe's main ingredient, or the cost to the silent figure who prepared it. The Croft Plantation Ledger reveals a pattern that would chill any decent soul who possessed the courage to decode its entries. Beginning in 1828 with Jeremiah's purchase, the records show a steady acquisition of individuals marked not for field work or house service, but with the simple, damning notation, "for kitchen." These purchases followed a deliberate selection process. The Crofts sought out strong, healthy specimens, typically young men and women between the ages of 18 and 30, often described in the margins as well-muscled or prime condition. They paid premium prices for these individuals, sometimes double what comparable slaves commanded at market, a cost that would have bankrupted lesser families but represented a sound investment to the Crofts. What made these acquisitions particularly sinister was their systematic isolation from the plantation's general population. Unlike other enslaved people who lived in the communal quarters, worked alongside established crews, and became part of the plantation's social fabric, those marked "for kitchen" simply vanished into the detached cooking compound. They were never seen working the fields, never appeared at communal meals, never integrated into the careful hierarchy that governed plantation life. The ledger entries stop there. No records of illness, no documentation of escape attempts, no transfers to other properties. These human beings simply disappeared from all official documentation, as if they had never existed at all. The only trace of their presence was the continuing excellence of the Croft family's table, and the ever-expanding contentment of the hogs that rooted in the pens behind the smokehouse. Eli, forced into this machinery of horror at age 12, became intimately familiar with every step of the process. Under Jeremiah's terrified tutelage, and later through his own grim experience, he learned the techniques that the Croft family had refined over generations. The smokehouse was equipped not just with the standard hooks and racks for curing meat, but with specialized tools, heavy tables stained dark with use, and drainage systems that channeled waste directly to the hog pens. The family had particular preferences developed through decades of consumption. Ambrose Croft favored cuts from the shoulder and thigh, prepared with herbs that Lavinia cultivated in her private garden. The twins preferred their portions prepared as that famous stew, slow-cooked until the meat fell apart at the touch of a fork. Every member of the family had learned to distinguish between the subtle flavors that came from different ages, different levels of physical conditioning, different states of fear at the time of preparation. What no one outside the family understood was the precision required to maintain their system. Timing was critical. Portions had to be calculated exactly, and every scrap of evidence had to be disposed of with meticulous care. The hogs served a dual purpose, consuming not just the offal and bones, but eliminating any trace that might raise uncomfortable questions from visitors or authorities. This was more than mere consumption. It was an industry, a factory of horror that operated with clockwork efficiency, where human beings were reduced to inventory, processed with the same cold calculation that other plantations applied to cotton or tobacco. The system had functioned flawlessly for over 2 decades, sustained by the forced labor of cooks who understood that their own survival depended on their silence and skill. If you're still watching, subscribe because this story goes deeper into darkness than you can imagine. This system ran with the precision of a clock for over 20 years, until the gears of the machine itself began to plot its destruction. By 1855, the isolation that protected the Croft family's secret had begun to breed suspicion in the one man whose livelihood depended on regular contact with Redwater Reach. Benjamin Bayou Ben Thibodeau operated the ferry that provided the only access to the plantation, a weathered Creole whose knowledge of the Delta's treacherous currents made him indispensable to the Crofts, despite his growing unease. Ben had been transporting supplies to the plantation for nearly 15 years, and his manifest records reveal a pattern that should have raised questions much sooner. Regular deliveries included the standard plantation supplies, salt and flour and lamp oil, but also items that seemed excessive for a family of 4. Enormous quantities of butcher's salt, specialized cutting tools ordered from New Orleans, and most disturbing of all, sealed crates marked only as provisions for kitchen that arrived under cover of darkness and were always collected personally by the silent cook. What troubled Ben most was not what he transported, but who he never saw. In all his years of service, he had never encountered any of the individuals marked "for kitchen" in his passenger logs. They would board his ferry at the Cypress Crossing dock, usually in the company of one of the Croft twins, but Ben never saw them make the return journey. When he inquired about their welfare, he was told they had settled in well or found their place on the plantation. The disappearance of Cora, a young housemaid who had worked at the main house, finally pushed Ben to voice his concerns. Cora had been different from the others marked "for kitchen." She had worked alongside the regular household staff, had friends among the field hands, had even attended the small chapel services that Reverend Albee conducted for the enslaved community. Her sudden absence left a void that could not be easily explained away. When Ben approached Sheriff Josiah Hale with his suspicions, he found a man more interested in maintaining the status quo than investigating uncomfortable truths. Hale, whose own political ambitions depended on the support of families like the Crofts, dismissed Ben's concerns with the practiced indifference of someone who had learned not to ask questions that might disturb the social order. According to the sheriff's own records, he filed Ben's report as a routine missing person case, noting that Cora had likely absconded in search of freedom and closing the matter without further investigation. The single-line entry in his disappearance docket reveals more through its brevity than any detailed report could have accomplished. A bureaucratic dismissal that ensured no uncomfortable questions would reach the ears of respectable society. Ben's frustration with official indifference led him to seek out other ears that might listen to his concerns. He spoke quietly to fellow boatmen, to traders who worked the river routes, to anyone who might have noticed the patterns that troubled his sleep. But the Croft family's reputation for respectability and their generous contributions to local institutions had created a protective barrier around their operations that proved impenetrable to mere suspicion. What Ben could not have known was that his inquiries had not gone unnoticed by the very family he sought to investigate. The twins, Silas and Phineas, had their own network of informants among the merchants and dock workers of Cypress Crossing, and reports of the ferryman's questions soon reached their ears. With the law willfully blind and the community invested in maintaining comfortable illusions, the only justice possible would be a private and terrible reckoning. In the weeks leading up to the 1859 Founders' Day feast, a dangerous desperation began to consume the Croft family. The ledger shows no new acquisitions since the previous winter, an unprecedented gap in their carefully maintained supply chain. The family's appetites had not diminished, but their sources had grown increasingly wary, spooked by Ben's questions and the growing attention that surrounded Cora's disappearance. Ambrose Croft's demands grew more insistent with each passing day. The patriarch had built his reputation on the legendary quality of the annual feast, and he made it clear to Eli that this year's meal must be exceptional, worthy of the family's standing and the expectations of their guests. The cook's haunted silence in response only seemed to fuel Ambrose's agitation, a man accustomed to absolute obedience who found himself dependent on the skills of someone he could never fully trust. The twins, Silas and Phineas, were dispatched to remedy the situation through more direct means. Where previous acquisitions had been conducted through established channels, carefully documented transactions that maintained a veneer of legitimacy, the brothers now prowled the plantation's existing population like wolves selecting prey from a frightened flock. They began with casual inspections of the field hands, their eyes appraising muscle tone and health with the calculating gaze of butchers evaluating livestock. The enslaved community, already living under constant threat of violence and separation, recognized a new and more sinister danger in the twins' scrutiny. Mothers pulled their children closer when the young masters passed. Fathers positioned themselves between their families and the brothers' predatory stares. Eli watched this escalation with the cold understanding of someone who had learned to read the subtle signs of the family's hunger. He observed the twins' increasingly frequent visits to the slave quarters, their whispered conferences with their father, the way Lavinia's pale eyes had begun to linger on certain individuals during her garden walks. The cook understood that the family's systematic approach to acquisition was breaking down, replaced by a more immediate and reckless desperation. The ledger's blank pages where new entries should have appeared told their own story of a supply chain under pressure. For 20 years, the Croft family had operated with methodical precision, their needs met through careful planning and discreet transactions. Now, faced with the prospect of disappointing their guests or admitting weakness, they were prepared to jeopardize everything they had built. What terrified the other slaves was not just the twins' obvious selection process, but Eli's reaction to it. The cook had always been a figure of mystery and fear among the plantation's population, his knowledge of the family's secrets making him untouchable, but also marking him as somehow complicit in their horror. Now, as the twins' search grew more desperate, those who watched carefully noticed a change in Eli's demeanor, a tightening around his eyes that spoke of calculations being made and decisions being reached. The plantation's atmosphere grew thick with unspoken dread. Every slave understood that someone among them would soon vanish, selected for purposes that were whispered about but never openly discussed. The twins made no effort to hide their evaluation process, their confidence born from decades of absolute power and the certainty that no authority would question their choices. But Eli knew something the rest of the plantation did not. As he sharpened his knives with new intensity, preparing implements that had served the family's needs for over 2 decades, he understood that the twins' search had already reached its conclusion. The next name to appear in the ledger would be his own, the cook who had served faithfully but could no longer be trusted with the family's most precious secrets. Eli knew then that the family's hunger was turning inward, and his name was next on the ledger. What the Croft family never suspected, in their arrogant assumption of absolute control, was that their silent cook possessed a skill they had never intended to give him. Eli had taught himself to read using the very ledger that documented their crimes, studying the entries by candlelight in the pre-dawn hours when even the hogs slept soundly in their pens. Night after night, as the family slumbered in their beds, Eli would trace his finger along the damning entries, decoding the careful notations that marked each human life reduced to inventory. He learned to recognize the patterns, the seasonal rhythms of acquisition, the careful calculations that balanced supply with demand. Most importantly, he understood that his own survival had always been temporary, a convenience that would be terminated the moment he became more liability than asset. The ledger told him everything he needed to know about his fate. 21 years of entries showed that no cook had ever served the family for more than a decade. Jeremiah had lasted 10 years before his name was struck through with black ink. His predecessor, a man named Moses, whose entry dated back to 1818, had served for 9 years before vanishing from the records. The pattern was clear, methodical, and absolutely final. With this knowledge burning in his mind, Eli began to plan his own survival with the same meticulous attention to detail that the Crofts applied to their consumption. He had learned from Jeremiah's failed attempt that escape was impossible. The bayou too treacherous, the patrols too thorough, the distances too great. But 21 years of forced service had given him intimate knowledge of something far more valuable than geography. He knew the family's weaknesses. Deep in the maze of cypress and Spanish moss that surrounded Redwater Reach, Eli sought out Old May, a root doctor whose knowledge of the bayou's botanical secrets had sustained her through decades of isolation. May lived in a cabin built on stilts, surrounded by gardens that grew plants most folks had sense enough to avoid, herbs that could heal or harm depending on the skill and intent of the person who gathered them. The transaction between cook and root doctor was conducted in whispers and shadows, two figures who understood the delicate balance between survival and revenge. May asked few questions about Eli's needs, recognizing in his haunted eyes the look of someone who had been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. When he spoke of needing something for ailing hogs, something to ease their suffering, she nodded with the wisdom of someone who had learned to read between the lines of desperate requests. The bitter root that May provided was a marvel of natural chemistry, a gnarly tuber that grew in the deepest, darkest corners of the swamp, where even experienced hunters feared to venture. She explained its properties with clinical precision, how it mimicked the symptoms of heart failure, how it worked slowly enough to avoid suspicion, how it left no trace that any coroner of that era could detect. Old May's letter to her sister, discovered years later among her effects, provides the only record of this transaction. Written in the barely legible script of someone who had learned letters late in life, it speaks of that quiet cookman and his request for her special bitter root, noting that he claimed it was, for the hogs, what ail. The letter's fragmented sentences hint at May's understanding that this was no ordinary veterinary consultation, but she was wise enough to maintain the fiction that protected them both. As Eli made his way back through the treacherous bayou paths, the bitter root wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, he carried with him more than just a means of revenge. He carried the accumulated weight of 21 years of horror, the memory of every life that had passed through his kitchen, the knowledge that he alone possessed the power to balance the scales that had been weighted against justice for far too long. The final ingredient for the Croft family's Last Supper was not bought from a trader or grown in their garden, but harvested from the very land they believed they owned. October 15, 1859, dawned with the oppressive humidity that marked the end of the Delta summer, the air thick with the promise of storms that would not come for hours yet. In the detached kitchen of the Croft plantation, Eli began preparations for what he knew would be his final service to the family that had consumed 21 years of his life. The bill of lading from Bayou Bend, delivered 3 days prior, showed the last supplies to reach Redwater Reach. One crate marked simply as "Dry Goods for Croft Kitchen" and signed for with Eli's distinctive X. But the crate had contained more than flour and spices. Hidden beneath the legitimate provisions, wrapped in oiled cloth and marked with symbols only Eli could read, lay the bitter root that would transform this annual celebration into a final reckoning. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, Eli moved through his preparations with the methodical precision of a man who had performed these rituals hundreds of times before. But today, every gesture carried the weight of deliberate intent. The famous stew that had earned praise from Reverend Albee and countless other guests began to take shape in the massive iron pot that dominated the kitchen hearth. The meat, prepared according to techniques that had horrified him for over 2 decades, was seasoned with herbs from Lavinia's private garden, salt that had preserved unspeakable cuts, and spices that masked flavors no decent palate should ever recognize. But today, one additional ingredient joined the mixture, ground so fine that it dissolved completely into the rich, dark broth, invisible to any examination but deadly in its purpose. Eli prepared not just the centerpiece stew, but every dish that would grace the Croft table that evening. The cornbread received its measure of bitter root mixed into the flour. The vegetables, swimming in butter and herbs, carried their own lethal addition. Even the wine that would accompany the meal had been doctored with a liquid extract that May had provided, bitter enough to complement the vintage's natural tannins. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, the Croft family gathered in their formal dining room, resplendent in their finest clothes and jewelry, their faces bright with anticipation for the feast that had become legendary throughout the Delta region. Ambrose took his place at the head of the table, Lavinia at his right hand, the twins flanking them like bookends of inherited privilege and cultivated cruelty. Eli served the meal with the same silent efficiency that had characterized his service for over 20 years, moving between kitchen and dining room like a ghost in livery, refilling glasses and replacing empty platters with the smooth competence of someone who had learned that visibility meant vulnerability. The family barely acknowledged his presence, their attention focused entirely on the exceptional quality of the food before them. Ambrose praised the stew's complex flavor, noting that it surpassed even the previous year's remarkable preparation. Lavinia complimented the cornbread's unusual richness, while the twins competed to consume the largest portions, their appetites as voracious as their fathers had been at their age. They ate with the satisfied confidence of apex predators, secure in their position atop a food chain they believed they had created and would always control. For 45 minutes, the sounds of contented consumption filled the dining room. Conversation flowed as smoothly as the poisoned wine, touching on business matters, social obligations, and plans for the coming winter season. No one noticed that their silent servant had not returned to clear the final course, that the kitchen had grown unusually quiet despite the evening's demands. Then Lavinia's fork clattered to her plate. The first symptoms manifested as a tightness in the chest, a fluttering irregularity in heartbeats that had pumped poison through 4 bodies with methodical efficiency. Silas attempted to rise from his chair, but found his legs unsteady beneath him. Phineas reached for his wine glass with hands that trembled uncontrollably. Ambrose, the patriarch who had ruled his twisted kingdom with absolute authority, could only stare in growing horror as his vision began to blur and his breath came in shallow gasps. From the kitchen doorway, Eli watched the family's final moments with the same dispassionate expression he had worn while serving their unspeakable meals for over 2 decades. He made no move to help, offered no comfort, spoke no words of explanation or farewell. He simply observed as the system they had created to consume others finally consumed them. As the last of the Crofts drew their final breath, the second, more gruesome phase of Eli's plan began. The legend that grew around the events of October 15th speaks of fire, of flames that consumed the Croft Manor and left nothing but ash and twisted metal, where a family once ruled their twisted kingdom. Local folklore passed down through generations of Delta families tells of supernatural retribution, of ghostly flames that burned without leaving scorch marks, of a conflagration that somehow spared the surrounding buildings while reducing the main house to cinders. But the coroner's report, brief as it was, contains a detail that contradicts every whispered story told in the taverns of Cypress Crossing. The official document, filed by a man more interested in closing uncomfortable cases than investigating them thoroughly, states simply that no bodies recovered for inquest, presumed lost in a fire or absconded, case suspended. No bodies recovered, not burned beyond recognition, not reduced to skeletal remains, but simply absent entirely. The truth of what happened in the hours following the family's death was far more methodical, far more deliberate, and infinitely more horrifying than any supernatural explanation. Eli trained for over 2 decades in the precise techniques that the Croft family had demanded of their kitchen operations, applied those same skills to a final, comprehensive task. Working through the night by the light of oil lamps, Eli systematically dismembered the bodies of his former masters with the same clinical efficiency he had been forced to apply to countless victims over the years. The heavy tables in the smokehouse, stained dark from decades of use, served their purpose one final time. The specialized tools that had been imported from New Orleans, the bone saws and butcher's knives that had processed unspeakable cuts, performed their last service under Eli's steady hands. But unlike the previous victims whose remains had been prepared for the family's consumption, the Croft bodies were destined for a different fate entirely. Piece by methodical piece, every scrap of flesh and fragment of bone was carried to the hog pens that had served as the final disposal point for evidence throughout the family's reign of horror. The hogs, conditioned by years of irregular but substantial feeding, consumed their feast with the same voracious efficiency they had always displayed. But this time, the source of their satisfaction was not the discarded remains of the family's victims, but the family themselves, reduced to nothing more than fodder for the very system they had created to dispose of evidence. By dawn, the hogs grunted with unusual satisfaction, their bellies distended from the most substantial meal they had received in months. The smokehouse had been scrubbed clean with lye and ash, its surfaces restored to the pristine condition that Ambrose Croft had always demanded. The main house showed no signs of violence or struggle, its rooms arranged with the same meticulous order that had characterized the family's public presentation. The irony was perfect in its symmetry. For over 20 years, the Croft family had used their hogs to dispose of the evidence of their crimes, feeding the animals scraps and bones that would otherwise have raised uncomfortable questions. Now those same hogs had consumed the criminals themselves, turning the family's own system of evidence disposal against them in the most complete way imaginable. When Sheriff Hale arrived 3 days later, responding to concerns raised by neighbors who had noticed the unusual silence from the normally active plantation, he found an estate that appeared to have been abandoned in perfect order, no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence, no indication that anything more dramatic than a sudden departure had taken place. By sunrise, the only thing left of the Croft bloodline was the satisfied grunting of their livestock. Sheriff Josiah Hale's investigation into the Croft family's disappearance lasted exactly 4 hours. His official report, filed on October 20th, 1859, provides a masterclass in willful blindness, disguised as thorough law enforcement. The document describes his methodical examination of the main house, his interviews with neighboring plantation owners, and his conclusion that the family had simply departed for an extended European tour without bothering to inform their local acquaintances. The sheriff's cursory inspection found no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, no indication that anything more sinister than sudden wanderlust had motivated the family's departure. The main house remained in perfect order, furniture arranged with the same meticulous precision that had characterized Lavinia Croft's domestic management. Silver remained in its proper places, artwork hung undisturbed on the walls, and the family's extensive library showed no signs that anyone had hastily packed their most precious volumes. What Hale chose not to investigate were the details that might have suggested a different narrative. He did not question why a family known for their careful business management would abandon a profitable plantation without arranging for its continued operation. He did not wonder why their extensive network of social obligations had been left without explanation or apology. Most tellingly, he did not inquire about the fate of the enslaved cook who had served the family for over 2 decades. The broader community of Cypress Crossing embraced the sheriff's explanation with the eager relief of people who preferred comfortable lies to disturbing truths. The Croft family's sudden departure became the subject of drawing room speculation, with various theories emerging about their destination and motives. Some believed they had sailed for England to explore Ambrose's genealogical obsessions. Others suggested that pressing business matters had called them to New Orleans or New York. The plantation itself was offered for sale through agents in Natchez, but found few serious buyers. Prospective purchasers were put off by the property's isolation, the declining fertility of soil that had been worked for generations, and persistent rumors about the unusual events that had preceded the family's departure. The asking price, initially set at a level that reflected the estate's former prosperity, was reduced repeatedly as months passed without legitimate offers. Local slaves and free blacks, whose understanding of the plantation's true nature had always been more complete than their white neighbors cared to acknowledge, avoided the property entirely. They spoke in whispers of the cook who had vanished along with his masters, of hog pens that had fallen silent, of a kitchen that no longer sent smoke signals into the Delta air. Their folk knowledge, passed down through networks that existed beneath the notice of official society, preserved truths that written records had been designed to obscure. By 1861, when the Civil War began to reshape the entire social structure of the Mississippi Delta, the Croft plantation had become a symbol of the old order's decay. The main house stood empty, its windows boarded against the elements, its grand columns beginning to show the first signs of the rot that would eventually claim them. The detached kitchen, where so much horror had been prepared and served, remained locked and abandoned, its secrets sealed within walls that no one had the courage to breach. The official memory of the Croft family, preserved in church records and business documents, speaks of a distinguished lineage that had contributed significantly to the region's development. Their charitable donations continued to be acknowledged in annual reports, their social prominence remembered in the memoirs of Delta society. The uncomfortable questions about their sudden disappearance were gradually forgotten as more pressing concerns captured the community's attention. The official record was sealed with a theory of abandonment, but one man knew the truth of the silence he had created. More than a century and a half later, the ruins of Croft Manor stand as a testament to time's relentless hunger for the monuments of the wicked. The white columns that once symbolized Southern aristocracy now lean at precarious angles, their paint long since surrendered to the relentless humidity of the Mississippi Delta. Spanish moss drapes the skeletal remains of the structure like funeral shrouds, and cypress trees have reclaimed much of what was once carefully manicured grounds. Local historians in Cypress Crossing speak of the property with the careful neutrality of people who understand that some stories are best left undisturbed. The official narrative, preserved in tourist brochures and historical society publications, describes the Croft family as tragic victims of the social upheaval that preceded the Civil War, a distinguished lineage that simply faded away like so many others during that turbulent period. But the locals who venture near Redwater Reach tell different stories, or tales that have been passed down through generations of families who remember when the old ferry still operated and the plantation's smoke could be seen for miles. They speak of sounds that echo from the abandoned structures on still nights, of shadows that move through the ruins when no living thing should cast them, of an atmosphere that feels heavy with secrets too dark for casual exploration. The most disturbing modern reports come from hunters who work the bayou country that has reclaimed much of the former plantation grounds. They describe encounters with feral hogs of unusual size and aggression, descendants of the swine that once rooted in the pens behind the long collapsed kitchen. These animals, they claim, display an intelligence that borders on the uncanny, watching human intruders with what one hunter described as a knowing look that chills you to the bone. Wildlife biologists who have studied the local hog population note several anomalies that have no clear scientific explanation. The animals in this particular region grow larger than their counterparts elsewhere in the Delta, despite having access to the same food sources. Their behavior patterns show unusual territorial aggression, and they seem to avoid areas where other wildlife congregates, as if they understand their own difference from the natural order. The remains of the detached kitchen, now little more than a foundation overgrown with thorny vines, continue to attract curious visitors despite the warnings of local authorities. Urban explorers and paranormal investigators regularly attempt to access the site, though most leave quickly and few return for a second visit. Those who linger long enough to examine the remnants of the smokehouse report finding bone fragments embedded in the soil, remains that seem too numerous and too varied to be explained by ordinary livestock processing. Modern forensic techniques applied to samples collected by curious graduate students have yielded results that local law enforcement prefers not to discuss publicly. The fragments show evidence of systematic processing, cuts made with precision instruments, modifications that suggest purposes beyond any legitimate agricultural operation. But without context, without official investigation, without anyone willing to ask the questions that might lead to uncomfortable answers, these findings remain academic curiosities rather than evidence of historical crimes. The ferry landing where Bayou Ben once transported supplies and passengers has long since collapsed into the muddy waters of the Mississippi. But on certain evenings, when the mist rises from the river and the cypress trees stand like sentinels against the fading light, visitors report hearing sounds that might be oars cutting through water, voices calling across distances that time should have rendered unbridgeable. The land, it seems, remembers what the town chose to forget. Of all the mysteries surrounding October 15th, 1859, Eli's fate remains the most elusive. No record exists of his departure from Redwater Reach. No witness testimony places him anywhere following the Croft family's final meal. Like those he had served for over 2 decades, he simply vanished from history, leaving behind only questions and the terrible silence of a story no one wanted to hear. The ferry logs show no passenger crossings in the week following the family's disappearance. Sheriff Hale's investigation made no mention of the missing cook, as if a man essential to the plantation's operations for 21 years had never existed. The community, eager to accept comfortable explanations, never asked what became of the silent figure who had moved through their gatherings like a ghost. Some claim Eli used his knowledge of the bayou to disappear into the maze of cypress and Spanish moss, surviving as a hermit in the deep swamp where hunters feared to venture. They speak of occasional sightings over the years, a solitary figure glimpsed at the edges of vision, moving through mist-shrouded waterways with silent confidence. Others believe he walked north, following routes that carried so many toward freedom, carrying secrets that would die only when he did. In this version, Eli becomes one of countless unnamed figures who vanished into the anonymous masses of a nation torn by war, his knowledge buried beneath more immediate concerns of survival. But the most telling clue lies in the ledger itself. The final entry, made in the same careful handwriting that documented 21 years of horror, records a single purchase that speaks volumes about the cook's intentions. Next to the bitter root notation, signed with Eli's distinctive X, appears a quantity far exceeding what would poison a family of 4. The implications are chilling. Eli had not simply planned the Croft family's destruction. He had prepared for his own departure from a world that showed him nothing but cruelty. Whether he used the remaining poison to escape memories that haunted his dreams, or saved it for purposes known only to himself, the ledger suggests a man who calculated every outcome of his terrible revenge. The Croft plantation ledger was discovered decades later by workers demolishing the main house remains. Hidden beneath loose floorboards in Ambrose's private study, the leather-bound book had survived floods, fires, and the slow decay that claimed everything else the family built. That ledger now rests in a private collection, viewed only by researchers who have signed discretion agreements. The final entry, with its notation of bitter root and Eli's unmistakable X, remains the last mark he left on the world, the only signature on a story that could never be told in its entirety. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories that history tried to bury, because the past never stays buried for long. The cook finally left his kitchen, having served his last meal, and in doing so, authored the only version of this story that could ever be told.